exact, until it was disestablished in 1992 and its aircraft absorbed into the Air Combat Command ACC in 2010. All B-52 Stratofortresses were transferred from the ACC to the newly created Air Force Global Strike Command, AFX. Superior performance at high subsonic speeds and relatively low operating costs have kept the B-52 in service despite the advent of later, more advanced aircraft, including the cancelled Mach 3 B-72 Valkyrie, the variable geometry B-1 Lancer, and the stealth B-2 Spirit. The B-52 completed 60 years of continuous service with its original operator in 2015. After being upgraded between 2013 and 2015, it is expected to serve into the 2040s.
Table test, south test, we're good.
Marines will be deployed to Norway and 4 Royal Air Force Typhoon fighter planes will patrol Icelandic skies, Defense Secretary Gavin Williamson told his ruling Conservative Party's annual conference on Sunday. He also said he'll boost training to tackle the threat of Kremlin-sanctioned cyber attacks. The Defense Secretary is responding to British analysis which shows Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic Ocean has almost reached Cold War levels. From 2020 the new P-8 Poseidon submarine hunting aircraft will also be deployed. As the ice melts and new shipping routes emerge, The significance of the high North and Arctic region increases, Williamson told delegates in Birmingham, England. Russia, with more submarines operating under the ice and ambitions to build over 100 facilities in the Arctic, are staking a claim and militarizing the region. We must be ready to deal with all threats as they emerge. Diplomatic relations with Vladimir Putin's Russia are at the lowest level since the height of Cold War in the 1970s, following the use of a weapons-grade nerve agent on British soil and Russia's subsequent denials of involvement. At the United Nations General Assembly last week, Prime Minister Theresa May accused Russia of flagrantly breaching international norms. Williamson said the government's listening
neuroscience with a small group of volunteers from SEAL Team 6, the group that killed Osama bin Laden, and other units, according to military.com. Early results show promising signs, said spokesman Captain Jason Salata in a statement. The $749 Halo neuroscience headset looks a lot like regular headphones, and does actually play music. However, it also has silicon spikes on the band called neuroprimers that contact a wearer's head. Those emit electrical impulses that supposedly stimulate the motor cortex, a part of the brain that's key for athletes, soldiers and others who perform physically demanding tasks. The soldier or athlete simply sprays the spikes with saline solution to ensure good electrical contact, then wears the headset during warm-ups. The tingling they feel on their scalp supposedly increases the neuroplasticity of the brain, making it more receptive than usual to training. The company insists that they're ideal for elite athletes or soldiers, where a small improvement in performance can make the winning, or living, difference. The idea is to make training shorter and more efficient for Navy SEALs, who are already running on the ragged edge. They're training at this amazingly high level, and the amount they can train is actually limited by things like physical recovery, Halo co-founder Brett Wingier told military.com. They want to build and maintain these amazing physical skills, but do so just as efficiently as possible. The effort is part of Navy Special Operations Commander Tim Zymanski's industry challenge to develop cognitive enhancement technology for soldiers. While that could include pharmaceutical aids and other things, the military is particularly interested in neurostimulation tech as a way to enhance both performance and learning. Halo claims that the devices have improved the performance of Olympic and professional athletes, like the San Francisco Giants, above, but they can't necessarily prove that those gains are the direct results of the headset and not, say, a placebo effect, or that workouts Spotify. That report and its findings will likely be made public, but other portions may be deemed sensitive, they said. Multiple active and retired military arms advocates and industry experts have presented papers and data on the alleged overmatch that U.S. troops face on the battlefield with their current calibers. One oft-noted recent study was authored by then Army Major Thomas Seyhart, who wrote a 2009 paper titled, Increasing Small Arms Lethality in Afghanistan, Taking Back the Infantry Half Kilometer. The paper drew from soldiers' experience in Afghanistan firefights. Seyhart wrote that half of the firefights infantry units in Afghanistan encountered were past 300 meters, and the 5.56mm round had lessened lethality at longer distances. He offered two solutions: a more effective 5.56mm round, or the better option of adopting a caliber in the 6.5mm to 7mm range. The Major then cited a 2006 study by the Joint Service Wound Ballistics Integrated Product Team, which also named the ideal caliber in the 6.5mm to 7mm size. This isn't the first time ammunition experts have reached that conclusion. There is a long-running debate, going back almost 100 years now, about the optimum small arm, said retired Major General Robert Scales, author of the 2016 book Scales on War, The Future of America's Military at Risk. Scales pointed to the development of the M1 rifle by John Garand in the 1920s. At the time, Garand built both a .30 caliber and a .276 caliber version of the rifle. But a surplus of .30 caliber ammunition from World War I, coupled later with the financial constraints of the Great Depression, led to senior defense officials and political leaders calling for a .30 caliber rifle. The M1's design eventually evolved into the M14. Both rifles share a 7.62mm or .30 caliber bore. But the M14 was soon discarded when, in the 1960s, Air Force Gen. Curtis LeMay purchased the early version of the M16 for some Air Force units. The M16 was then adopted across the branches and fielded for service in Vietnam, where troops reported frequent jamming and malfunctions in early versions of the weapon. One case, detailed in the 2010 book The Gun, by former Marine and award-winning journalist C.J. Chivers, grabbed national attention during the Vietnam War when Marine First Lieutenant Michael Chervenak wrote an open letter that recounted his company's experiences with the new rifle jamming in combat. The letter led to hearings in Congress and, along with other incidents, contributed to decades of controversy, modifications and adaptations, which resulted in the current M4 variants, which continue to have their supporters and critics. Major Thomas Campbell, a spokesman for Army Training and Doctrine Command, provided Army Times with the results of a 9-year, post-deployment survey of 9,000 soldiers conducted by the command. The survey saw 80% of troops rate the M4 as effective or better. The survey did not compare the M4 to other weapons, but instead asked the respondents to rate the overall effectiveness of the weapon in the performance of their duties while deployed. Campbell said, "The aging M16-M4 platform is nearing the end of its life cycle," Boeing said. "Right now their M16-M4 platform we have is a workhorse and very effective in the hands of a trained soldier or Marine," he said. But, Walker at Maneuver Center added, "The Army can't continue to ask more of the weapons system that has been in service for so long. Our next investment will likely be in a new operating platform," Boeing said. Critics of the M16-M4 and the 5.56mm round say no matter what has been done to improve the M16 and its subsequent variations, the 5.56mm round lacks the range and lethality needed in modern firefights. Some of the concerns Scales said he believes are driving military leaders to finally look at an alternative to the 5.56mm and the M16-M4 include improvements in adversaries' body armor, which make the 5.56mm less lethal. Current adversaries such as the Islamic State terror group and others using bigger rounds with more reach against U.S. troops, creating an overmatch. Jamming problems with M16-M4 variants that continue to plague the design. At the 2016 National Defense Industrial Association Armament Systems Forum, retired Brigadier General Dave Grange and Jim Schatz, an Army veteran and weapons expert who has since passed away, each gave presentations calling for a new intermediate caliber in the 6.5mm range. They also referenced the Russian, Islamic State and Al-Qaeda advantages with longer-reaching and more lethal weapons, including reports of Russian work on their own 6.5mm assault rifle. But, Scales said, one of the problems that led to the .30 caliber being adopted over the 6.5mm nearly a century ago still remains: an abundance of 5.56mm ammunition stockpiled across U.S. military commands and NATO, whose nations fire the 5.56mm and 7.6 satellites are the most expensive satellites to build and launch, and that some have antenna arrays as big as a football field. Boeing's wideband Global Satcom is one type of geosynchronous satellite that might benefit from being serviced in orbit. It is the highest capacity communications satellite the military operates, and critical to operations around the world. U.S. Air Force Space Command photo illustration, modified. But when the research agency goes up to Capitol Hill to explain its plan, it insists on meeting in a facility for handling sensitive compartmented information. That wouldn't be necessary if it was just talking about servicing communications satellites. Part of what it wants from its robot spacecraft is the ability to inspect, repair, modify and move geosynchronous spy satellites that are extremely expensive to replace. There's nothing wrong in principle with the idea. It could save the Pentagon, which hides most U.S. intelligence spending in its budget, a great deal of money. However, Because the program originated in the Obama years, there are a number of ways in which it is not likely to sit well with the Trump administration. For starters, DARPA has decided to award the program to SSL, the California subsidiary of Canadian company McDonnell Detwiller Associates, which means a foreign-owned entity would be engaged in supporting some of the intelligence community's most sensitive assets. Gaining access to these assets and the information they collect requires special clearances that a foreign-owned company would typically have great difficulty obtaining. Granting the clearances could only be justified if no suitable domestic provider of the same services existed. Which brings me to the second problem. Not only is the US company Orbital ATK already developing a similar capability that will be available sooner, but it is doing so with its own money rather than using federal funds. In other words, DARPA wants to use taxpayer money to set up a foreign-owned competitor to a solution that was already emerging spontaneously from the marketplace at no cost to the government. Orbital ATK already had a contract with commercial satellite operator Intelsat to service geosynchronous satellites in orbit before DARPA issued its initial solicitation for the program. So DARPA is wasting hundreds of millions of dollars in taxpayer money to help a foreign-owned company get into the business of supporting sensitive intelligence systems. Needless to say, DARPA has a different take on its plan. It says about 80% of geosynchronous satellites are operated by commercial companies rather than governments, and the capability it wants to develop would be able to support both types of spacecraft. But that raises a third problem. Under current national space policy, the government isn't supposed to be undercutting commercial companies or distorting commercial markets. In this case, DARPA is doing both. What the research agency proposes to do is pay nearly 90% of the cost for developing and launching the robotic servicing system, and then simply turn it over to the Canadian company, and any other qualified company that is interested, along with related intellectual property. The DARPA and the Defense Intelligence Agency, not a typo, did a lot of research into the possibility, but what was discovered is that while the bang was bigger, the weapon itself is problematic. The employment of a thermobaric weapon against a population is about half of a war crime. According to the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Criminal Court, ICC, has this to say on certain weapons. Pursuant to Article 82b(20) of the 1998 ICC statute, the following constitutes a war crime in international armed conflicts: employing weapons, projectiles and material and methods of warfare which are of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, emphasis added. Provided that such weapons, projectiles and material and methods of warfare are the subject of a comprehensive prohibition and are included in an annex to this statute. You see this phrase, superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, over and over again in the international laws of war. Truth is, the only reason thermobarics aren't a war crime in fact is because the international community has yet to officially name them as cruel weapons against the spirit of just about every single law of war that exists. Now, how does this cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering? Let's explore the mechanics of the weapon. Just before impact, the weapon discharges a cloud of atomized accelerant into the surrounding air. The weapon impacts and detonates its internal payload, which is not insignificant, and this in turn detonates the fuel-air mixture. In February of 2000, the Human Rights Watch quoted a study by the Darpa on thermobarics. Their blast-kill mechanism against living targets is unique and unpleasant. What kills is the pressure wave, and more importantly, the subsequent rarefaction, vacuum, which ruptures the lungs. If the fuel deflagrates but does not detonate, victims will be severely burned and will probably also inhale the burning fuel. Since the most common fuels, ethylene oxide and propylene oxide, are highly toxic, undetonated Fe should prove as lethal to personnel caught within the cloud as most chemical agents. The CIA weighed in. The effect of an Fe explosion within confined spaces is immense. Those near the ignition point are obliterated. Those at the fringe are likely to suffer many internal, and thus invisible injuries, including burst eardrums and crushed-in rear organs, severe concussions, ruptured lungs and internal organs, and possibly blindness. And then another tidbit from the Darpa: shock and pressure waves cause minimal damage to brain tissue. It is possible that victims of Fe's are not rendered unconscious by the blast, but instead suffer for several seconds or minutes while they suffocate. I've had occasion to peruse the classified studies. They're way worse than they sound. I've seen people blown damn near in half. In ear, it's a little difficult to discern. He went from a tiny white spot to a much bigger, much more diffuse white spot and stopped moving during CAS missions. I've seen people